So let's talk about a guy who conquered a continent, only to lose it all. For about a decade, Napoleon Bonaparte was the master of Europe. He was a military genius who literally redrew the map. But his ambition, the very thing that powered his incredible rise, would end up leading him from his absolute greatest triumphs to the abyss of total defeat. So how did it all go so wrong? Let's get into it.
Okay, picture this. It's December 1804. We're inside the magnificent Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. And Napoleon, who started out as the son of a pretty minor noble family from Corsica, he takes the emperor's crown and places it on his own head. An unbelievable act of self-coronation. This was the climax of a stunning 10-year climb from obscurity to absolute power, a climb fueled by revolution and constant war.
So how did this massive empire rise and then fall so spectacularly? Well, here's the game plan. First up, we're going to look at the emperor's masterpiece, that military machine he built that seemed absolutely unbeatable. Then we'll dig into the great continental blunder, the huge mistake that planted the seeds of his downfall. From there, it's the catastrophe in Russia, really the beginning of the end, and finally, the total collapse of his empire.
Right, so to really get why Napoleon was so dominant, you have to understand his army, the legendary Grande Armée. Now, this wasn't just a bigger-than-average group of soldiers. Oh no, it was a revolutionary new kind of fighting force, and it was built around one of his most brilliant, truly game-changing ideas.
This right here was Napoleon's secret weapon, the core system. See, before Napoleon, armies were these slow, clumsy masses that had to stick together all the time. But Napoleon's genius was to break his massive army into these smaller, independent corps. You can think of them like little mini-armies, each with its own infantry, cavalry, and artillery. This let them march separately, move way faster, and live off the land. His enemies just couldn't keep up. They could spread out to confuse his opponents, and then bam, converge like a fist to crush them.
And wow, does this show you just how devastating it could be? In 1805, Napoleon faced down an Austrian army in Germany, and he put on an absolute masterclass. He set his cavalry to make a lot of noise in the Black Forest, tricking the Austrians into thinking he was coming straight at them. But at the same time, his corps were moving with incredible speed, sweeping way around to the north, crossing the Danube River behind the Austrians. They completely cut off their escape. The Austrian commander, General Mack, he literally had no idea what was happening until his entire army was trapped.
And the result of all that fancy footwork? Get this, 60,000 Austrian soldiers were taken prisoner, and they surrendered without a single major battle being fought. I mean, that's a strategic knockout punch right at the start of the war. An entire enemy army just gone, all thanks to the speed and flexibility of his Grande Armée.
But the war was far from over. A huge Russian army was still on its way to link up with what was left of the Austrians. Napoleon's own army was now deep in enemy territory. His supply lines were getting dangerously long, and winter was coming. He couldn't afford to get bogged down. He needed one big, decisive fight, and he needed it now.
And that battle was Austerlitz, fought on the one-year anniversary of his coronation, no less. He was facing the combined forces of the Russian and Austrian emperors. So what does he do? He pulls this incredible trick. He makes his right flank look super weak, practically begging the Allies to attack it. And they take the bait. They abandon the high ground to crush his supposedly weak flank. The second they do, Napoleon unleashes his main force right through their weakened center, shattering their army. It was a victory so perfect, so brilliant, it's still considered his absolute masterpiece.
Okay, so with Austria and Russia defeated, Napoleon is the undisputed king of the continent. But there's one big problem he just can't solve, an enemy his armies can't even reach, Great Britain. And this leads to what you might call the classic strategic dilemma of the whale versus the elephant.
It's a really simple way to think about it. France, under Napoleon, was the elephant, unstoppable on land. But Britain, with its Royal Navy, was the whale, unstoppable at sea. After the British Navy smashed the French fleet at the Battle of Trafalgar, there was just no way for Napoleon to invade Britain. But at the same time, Britain's army was way too small to challenge him in Europe. So how do you win a war when you can't physically get at your enemy? Napoleon's answer was to try and starve them out economically.
And this was his big idea, the continental system. The plan was pretty straightforward. If he couldn't invade Britain, he would bankrupt it. He declared that every single port under his control, which was basically all of mainland Europe, was forbidden from trading with the British. The hope was that by cutting off their biggest customers, he could trigger a financial collapse in Britain and force them to make peace.
Great idea in theory, right? But here's the thing. it just didn't work that well. Smuggling was everywhere, and the embargo hurt the economies of Napoleon's allies just as much as it hurt Britain's. And Napoleon's obsession with making this system airtight, with plugging every single leak, well, that obsession is what's going to drag him into 2 wars that will completely destroy his empire.
First stop on this road to ruin, Spain. See, to stop Portugal from trading with Britain, Napoleon sent his troops through Spain. But then he got greedy. He saw the Spanish royal family was a mess, so he just decided to take over the country. Big mistake. The Spanish people rose up in this incredibly brutal guerrilla war, and they were backed by a British army. This Peninsula War became what Napoleon himself later called his bleeding ulcer. It just drained his empire of men, money, and morale, year after year with no end in sight.
But as bad as that Spanish ulcer was, it was nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to what was coming next. The other big leak in his continental system was Russia. Tsar Alexander I started quietly trading with Britain again, and for Napoleon that was a betrayal he just could not let stand. His response would be the biggest and most fatal gamble of his entire life.
So, in June 1812, Napoleon gathers the biggest army Europe has ever seen. We're talking 600,000 men. He crosses the Niemen River into Russia, fully expecting to march in, fight a quick, decisive battle, smash the Russian army, and force the Tsar to fall back in line. But the Russians had a very different plan.
The Russians play it smart. They refuse to give him that one big fight he's looking for. Instead, they just retreat, pulling him deeper and deeper into the endless Russian landscape, and they burn everything as they go. Napoleon does win a horrifically bloody battle at Borodino and even captures Moscow, but he finds the city in flames. He waits there for weeks, expecting the Tsar to offer a peace treaty, but nothing comes. As the brutal Russian winter starts to set in, he has no choice but to order a retreat. And what came next? Well, it was one of the worst military disasters in all of human history. This chart just lays it bare. It was annihilation. The general winter, combined with constant hit-and-run attacks from Russian Cossacks, just destroyed the Grande Armée. Of the 600,000 men who marched in, fewer than 20,000 managed to stumble back out. The heart and soul of his army, his veterans, his irreplaceable cavalry, just gone, wiped out.
That disaster in Russia was like blood in the water. All of Napoleon's old enemies, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, they saw their chance. They joined up with Russia and Britain to form a new final coalition. They sensed that Napoleon was finally weak enough to be finished, once and for all. Now, amazingly, Napoleon managed to raise a whole new army, mostly of young, inexperienced boys. But at Leipzig, in what became known as the Battle of the Nations, he was finally cornered. And just look at the numbers here. He is completely, totally outnumbered. For 3 days, the biggest battle Europe had ever seen raged on. And in the end, Napoleon suffered his first truly decisive defeat on the battlefield. His German allies abandoned him, and he was forced to retreat all the way back to France. The very next year, the Allies push into France itself. And even though Napoleon fought a brilliant defensive campaign, showing flashes of his old genius, the odds were just impossible. Paris fell, and his own generals, his marshals, finally came to him and told him it was over. The war was lost. So on April 6, 1814, with his enemies in his capital, Napoleon Bonaparte gave up his throne.
So after all that, the wars are finally over. But Europe is a completely different place. The old medieval order, like the Holy Roman Empire, was gone for good. New, powerful ideas like nationalism were taking hold everywhere. And out of all the chaos, Great Britain was now the top global power, a position it would hold for a century. But the cost was just staggering. Millions dead in a conflict that had engulfed an entire generation.
When you look back, Napoleon's story is just a perfect tragedy. I mean, here was a man of almost superhuman talent who flew closer to the sun than anyone before him. But was his fall just the result of a few key mistakes, like those massive blunders in Spain and Russia? Or was an empire built on endless, relentless war always destined to collapse under its own weight? And that's the big question his incredible story leaves for us to think about.